coming up, using Israeli hardware and U.S. funding, the government of the South American country of Colombia is brutally cracking down on protesters. We dive into that controversy next here on Watching the Hawks, so stay tuned.
Fascist regimes, autocratic leaders, authoritarian governments, they've existed for generations. But a new, vocal, and fearless group, unafraid to fight the power, is gaining steam and support. Protesters. The United States, the beacon of democracy it is, faced Black Lives Matter protests for the better part of 2020 in an effort to bring civil rights and equity to the Black community in the face of oppression and police violence. Those protesters faced tanks, tear gas, beatings, and other forms of brutal attacks from the police. In Colombia, protests have swept the nation. Citizens are speaking out against a government that commits mass human rights violations. These protesters have made their demands clear. They want a basic income, free tuition at public universities, reforms of the police system, and more. Where protesters speak out against government failures, abuses, and oppression, state-sponsored violence is soon to follow. The deaths of an estimated 41 Colombian protesters, hundreds of disappearances, and sexual assault allegations by police against protesters are only fueling a more fervent movement. The U.S. government might be key to ending the carnage against the protesters, but that intervention might be more complicated than it appears. Israel is aiding Colombia's crackdown of protesters. Israeli-made armed vehicles and military and police-issued weapons are a major part of the Colombian police arsenal, the same weapons and tanks Israel uses to quell its own dissension. Colombia's security forces are trained in counterterrorism and combat techniques by the Israeli Defense Forces. Because of America's long-standing relationship with Israel, the nation has always been reluctant to hold the Israeli government accountable for its role in human rights atrocities. But some advocates, they see glimmers of hope. 55 members of Congress signed onto a letter to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken expressing grave concern over the political and human rights situation. They're calling on Washington to denounce police brutality in Colombia and suspend military assistance and weapons sales. Calls to invoke the Leahy Law, a series of amendments that prohibit the U.S. Defense and State Departments from providing military assistance to foreign security units that violate human rights, are also ratcheting up. Joining me now is PhD researcher at the University of Nottingham, Oliver Dodd. Good to have you, Dr. Dodd.
Pleasure to be here, thank you.
So I really just want you to break this all down for us. How did we get here? The protests in Colombia are estimated to be the largest the nation has seen in decades. Historically, the Colombian government has quelled protesters pretty quickly. It doesn't seem to be working this go-round. Can you explain what's happening there on the ground?
So really what we've been seeing in Colombia over the last 2 decades really is the widespread use of state terrorism against ordinary protesters, peasant groups, and other working class forces. And the weapons, Israeli weapons, in terms of the Galil assault rifle and the Tanuf, is absolutely fundamental behind this kind of state violence against protesters. Armored vehicles have been widely used. The Sankat, the Israeli-produced Sankat, a custom-made Israeli armored vehicle, has been used to chase peaceful demonstrators off the streets of Bogota and terrorize them, sending fleeing for their lives. And I was actually able to record one of these incidents on my phone. Just outside my apartment here, I can see military soldiers and police both carrying Galil assault rifles. The Galil is used across all aspects of the security forces, the Navy, the Air Force, the police, and of course, the military. So Israel is heavily involved. And really what we need to understand about these protests is that it's a reaction to the kind of repressive activities that have been unleashed against ordinary people for many years, combined, of course, with the vast inequality in Colombia. It's one of the most unequal nations in the world. Land poverty is terrible, and it's growing. So we need to understand it in this context.
It's interesting because to me, these weapons and equipment you're describing kind of makes Israel the X factor here. As we said from reports of them, training Colombian security forces, and as you said, police and police to supplying arms and the weapons and the tanks being used against these protesters. It's Israel's hands are written all over these abuses because if they're supplying the weaponry, you're just as you're just as culpable. What do you feel should be done to end this partnership in cracking down on dissent? And do you see, what role do you see the United States playing in ending the war on protesters in Colombia, or what role can the United States play if more people put pressure on our government here?
Well, one of the things that I would say about the Colombian situation, really what we're talking about is a gangster regime. The military have so much influence. They're in bed with, what is really a tiny oligarchy of corrupt politicians. There's a lot of interest involved in terms of trying to preserve the military. It's related to certain political interests that see the military as really the last line of defense. I think if we didn't have a strong Colombian military that was so heavily supported by Israel and the United States, we'd see a much more democratic Colombia today. And one of the demands which was rejected in the recent peace processes in Colombia was to restructure the military, to basically downgrade the military so it's there to protect the borders and not used as a repressive instrument. And we could foresee these events happening because in the lead up to the national mobilization on the 28th of April, there was actually leaked military intelligence files which were showing how so widespread the military was spying on civilian forces, not just in Colombia, but also foreign forces. And we're seeing today in Colombia many of the right wing actually condemning peaceful protesters as terrorists, when the real terrorists is the state repression that has been taking place over the past few decades in Colombia.
Clearly.
And Doctor, do you think that the Leahy law, the law that exists basically to provide funding for regimes like Colombia, do you think that it's going to be invoked to end or uproot some of the support that the U.S. has provided to the Colombian government that we know is being used against protesters right now?
Well, one of the things we really need to become familiar with is the situation on the ground in Colombia. Colombia claims to pride itself on being a democracy, and many Republican politicians like Marco Rubio celebrate the Colombian gangster regime. And what we can really do, if we stand on the side of democracy and human rights, and we really are standing up for liberalism in the world, then we can start to pressure our politicians, in our respective countries to end support for state terrorism. And that's one of the things that, people in other countries, especially the United States, where U.S. influence is so crucial to backing up the Colombian repressive forces. One of the important things we can do is to lobby our politicians and to organize with the movements on the ground here in Colombia to establish links, especially with the most potent forces of the Colombian resistance.
It's interesting because in talking about the United States, the United States has a long history of abusing its own protesters. We saw it recently under the Trump administration with the images, of Black Lives Matter protesters being attacked in the streets by police and then, National Guard forces. To that end, and then we also saw the images from the civil rights protests of the 60s as well. Does the U.S. even have a leg to stand on when it comes, in your opinion, when it comes to this, considering the police abuses that have been rampant here throughout the last decades? I mean, nobody's hands are clean when it comes to police abuse of protesters and of free speech.
Yeah, that's very true. And one of the things we can certainly say in terms of making a comparison between Israel and Colombia, they've been compared in so many ways. But one of the important ways is that they both act as proxies for the United States for U.S. foreign policy and influence in their respective regions. So really, we can't expect, we're going to have to really organize a resistance movement in the United States, in places like Britain, in order to oppose this, because the United States certainly can't stand on 2 feet when it comes to Colombia. It's actually been absolutely fundamental behind the use of state terrorism against Palestinians by the Israeli state, and it's also been absolutely crucial behind the use of state terrorism in Colombia. And so we're really going to have to build, what I'm looking for is a multipolar world. And part of the reason for this repression in these respective countries is the opposition to a multipolar world, a world that it continues to be dominated by the United States and its proxies.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for joining us today and educating our audience on the situation going on in Colombia and all the different tentacles leading into that. Once again, PhD researcher from the University of Nottingham, Oliver Dodd. Thank you so much, Doctor.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.